Good afternoon, Nubian guys and goddesses, ladies and gentlemen. This is TB Wahid, and it's been quite some time since I did this reading. And life can surely send you through a couple of things. Storms. But it's good, it's okay now. The last time I read, I left off on the Klan rally at Stone Mountain, Georgia. And I was beginning with the breakfast in Arkansas Sedition Trial. And that is what I'm going to be reading tonight. I hope that you are able to enjoy this and take part in it with me as I read, because it is very, very interesting and also informative at the same time. The author's name is Raphael S. Ezekiel. The second gathering I will describe took place in 1988. It was not planned by the white racists, but by the United States Department of Justice, hoping apparently to amputate the leadership of the white supremacist movement. The Justice Department mounted a major trial in Fort Smith, Arkansas. The charge was conspiracy to commit sedition. The principal allegation was that the defendants, during a gathering hosted by the Aryan Nations organization at their compound in Hayden Lake, Idaho, had met with some 20 other people in the living room of the organization's chief and plotted together to overthrow the United States government. Now, doesn't that sound quite familiar? The defendants included three of the movement's most important leaders: Robert Miles of Michigan, who died 5 years later, Richard Butler of Idaho, and Louis Beam of Texas, along with a set of members of the terrorist cell known as the Order. The Order members were brought to Fort Smith from the penitentiaries in which they were serving long sentences for involvement in murder and armed robbery. They and Beam, who with his wife had tried to avoid arrest by fleeing to Mexico, spent their time in Fort Smith in jail when not in court. They entered and exited court in handcuffs that had to be unlocked to begin the day's proceedings. Miles and Butler were free on their own reconnaissance and had rented apartments in Fort Smith with their wives. I came to Fort Smith for 2 extended weekends, watched the trial, and had long talks with Miles and Butler. On my return from the second visit to Fort Smith, I wrote the notes that follow, which began with a breakfast in the restaurant at my motel. The blessing nearly catches me with a biscuit in my mouth. I have forgotten that both Robert Miles and Richard Butler are reverends. The food has arrived and I need my oatmeal. I am fiddling with the coffee jug, getting ready to dig in, when I notice that Miles has fallen silent. Pastor Butler has closed his eyes. He thanks Jesus quietly for the food. I look at Butler's worn face. Cardiac problems and 6 weeks of the trial here at Fort Smith are taking their toll. Head of Aryan Nations, Butler is 69. Miles, a former Grand Dragon of the Klan in Michigan and now a major theoretician of the far right, is 63. Like Butler, he has had serious health problems. He previously served 7 years in Marion, a tough prison. He is fairly sure he would not survive a second prison term. The present trial will end in a few days. Butler and Miles face long terms if convicted. Miles is a husky man with a lively face. His beard is thick, white, and well trimmed. His eyes are bright. He is not lean. He lives on a small farm northwest of Detroit and looks much like a vigorous farmer. Actually, like Butler, he is a former engineer. We joke that their ideas are the nonsense you can expect when engineers try to deal with social issues. Miles has a fast tongue and says outrageous things for effect. Butler, who speaks in a less dramatic fashion, had quadruple bypass surgery not long before the trial. His walk is slow. His wife, Betty, worries about him. I have known Miles and his wife, Dorothy, now for over a year. We have taped interviews on a regular basis. My contact with Butler has been more limited, but we have done some interviewing at the Aryan Nation's compound in Idaho. Prayers done, we begin to eat. While the reverends fill me in on the weeks of the trial that have gone by since my earlier visit to Fort Smith, the other defendants in the trial had chosen either to argue their own cases or to work as co-counsel with their lawyers. The defendants thus have been active in the courtroom, rising to make objections, rising to cross-examine government witnesses. Miles and Butler, who had chosen first-rate lawyers, have had to sit still, watching others. Passivity has quickly gone sour. The other defendants include Louis Beam and 11 men who took part in the brief, violent life of the underground gang called the Order. The reverends discussed the court appearance of Glenn Miller, the recent head of the White Patriot Party in North Carolina. Miller had been a bright star of the white racist movement, an emerging leader able to draw large numbers to his marches and demonstrations. Free on bail pending appeal after a conviction for running a paramilitary training camp, he had fled North Carolina and later been apprehended at a remote spot and in a drunken stupor. Now he has been brought from prison to Fort Smith to testify against his colleagues. I had already watched one of these turncoat witnesses during my first visit to Fort Smith. He had told the court that he had now seen the light, that he planned to write a book explaining how evil his former racist views were, that he regretted using for his own ends the counterfeit money that the Order had provided him, and that he would never do anything like that again. Like most of the government's witnesses, he was trading testimony for favors. Some have had sentences reduced. Some have had charges dropped. The scene in the third floor courtroom on that earlier day had been somber and striking. The long wood-framed windows descending from an unusually high ceiling to shoulder height. Their blinds shut so that sun could not come in and no one could look out to the Arkansas sky. The 14 defendants and their lawyers ranged around tables that formed a great U. The Justice Department lawyers in serious gray suits at their table, the rows of earnest jurors in their box, the laconic judge in black robes. 12 federal marshals in business suits had stood impassively along the perimeter of the room. In the morning, observers had been passed through unusually sensitive metal detectors on the ground floor and again at the door to the courtroom, linked by handcuffs, wrist to wrist in groups of 3. The jailed defendants, that is, everyone but Miles and Butler, had made their entry. Some of these men were serving long terms, 40 years, 60 years, 100 years, for their involvement with the order. They spoke with contempt as they cross-examined the witnesses who had previously worked with them and who now appeared for the government. The jury looked on, puzzled, studying, hoping to make sense of the kaleidoscope that was being assembled for them. The jurors were all white. Most were men, looking to be between 20 and 40 years old. They were dressed informally. Many had mustaches. 3 had beards. The several women were quietly attired. The youngest chewed gum. She studied the defendants very closely. After the testimony on that first visit, Miles and his wife and I had gone to their apartment to talk. He had shucked his courtroom clothes and reappeared in a bathrobe for a shower. He struck karate poses. "Hey!" he called out. "The dragon strikes." His wife had grinned, her ever-present cigarette burning in the ashtray by her coffee cup. "They should see you now," Dot had said. All of this had been hard on her, too, and she was less able to escape into humor and theater than her husband. The Justice Department's case would have it that Miles and Butler actively plotted the immediate overthrow of the government and that the order's actions sprang from the plotting. Miles and Butler, in truth, have devoted their lives rather openly to the attempt to undermine the present set of power relations. They certainly would welcome the chance to overthrow the government, but neither is ignorant or foolish. It is not plausible that they plotted directly and openly and out loud, at meetings of 20 or 30 people at a time, actions to assault the government. Had they wanted to do some planning, they would not have done so sitting in Butler's living room along with a crowd of strangers, knowing well that any gathering of racist extremists includes hidden FBI agents and paid informants. The impending indictments and trial had preoccupied Miles throughout our previous months of interviews in Michigan. Finally, one very cold April night at 9 o'clock, he had phoned me in my home to say that he had just received a tip that the FBI was planning to raid his place at 1 in the morning. Several right-wing people had died during attempted arrests in the previous few years. Miles was shaken. Why would the FBI be coming for him in the middle of the night? After some thought, I told Miles that I would drive out to the farm 30 miles away and sit with him, so that there would be a neutral witness on hand. We spent a long night in the old farmhouse, he and Dot and I and a couple of their friends. We sat at the dining room table most of the evening, with lights on everywhere to reassure any federal agents who might be outside. Resting his head on his arm periodically, Miles was tired and somber. The arrest he had been awaiting was at hand. He was sure that another prison term would kill him. He didn't know whether he would ever again, after this night, be in this room or with his wife as a free man. We sat through the night. Just before dawn, I drove back home to Ann Arbor to teach my classes. I called his wife at about 10. The FBI had arrived at 8. The arrest had been uneventful. Before driving out that evening, I had asked myself whether there was anything to fear from people at the farm. I could imagine several had bad scenarios, but decided they were unlikely. Though I got into my car with some misgivings, I was certain that I should trust my instincts. We work with the losers, Miles tells me now, as we tape record up in the motel room after our breakfast. Butler sits near us in a rocker. We talk of Miller's testimony. What does it mean for the movement, I ask, that the leaders recant in such haste, the followers in such numbers, that the attachment is so shallow? I can have respect for FBI agents, understand, Miles says, for witnesses, if they are being honest, but for these dogs, this filth, to be sitting up there as paragons of virtue all of a sudden. All my friends are black, or I found that all my thoughts about the Jews or the communists I've forswore those, and now I am holier than thou. Then when the winds change again, you decide to be back to what you were before. They are scum, Butler adds. We are looking at the death of the far right, Miles tells me, as he has before. The death of the racialist movement. Butler sighs. You try to accomplish something, in your lifetime, and pretty soon it's over and you haven't gotten anything accomplished. If you get sprung, I ask Miles, what are you going to do when you get back home? Teach people to be themselves and not to trust heroes, to think for themselves. I don't think that you'll find me any different than before the trial. That sounds good, I tell him. And you and I talk about some things we agree about, like economic decentralization. But I look at your newsletter that goes out from your farm to prisoners and thousands of people, and all it's about is martial struggle. He completes my sentence for me. Yes, we could have talked about a cripple overcoming his handicap, but you have to remember that martial struggle is the kind of heroism that Dick and I know about. He is reminding me that he fought with the Free French in World War II. He was a radio man on small planes that landed operatives at night in occupied France. But all the images you present, I repeat, only talk of struggle, only appear to fantasies of heroism. Don't forget, Miles says, who we are working with. We elected to take people from a certain income class primarily. We elected to be their champions, like it or not. And they are the lower income people. They're not the middle class. They aren't the achievers. They aren't the winners. Unfortunately, he goes on, most of the people who follow in the right wing are the losers. They're the ones who have been dealt a bad hand to play with in the first place in the game of life. And we can't change their cards, but maybe we can do a little to teach them how to get the maximum out of a very poor hand. Because they are our people, we are concerned about them. We represent them, whether anyone else understands it or not. Miles glances out the window, then at me. They aren't the winners. Now, do you see what he just said? Because they are our people, we are concerned about them. We represent them, whether anyone else understands it or not. Miles is an adventurer, a born organizer. He must struggle. He must also believe in the struggle. Miles has led a life of considerable adventure. He spins romantic stories of his involvement with several underground organizations and intelligence services. And in the late 60s, he adopted the rough and ready population, whom he described as his present base. He had moved into the campaign of George Wallace, a popular campaign with congenial values, with some friends. He wrestled control of the Michigan branch of the United Klans from Birchers in order to use the Klansmen as campaign workers and to divert the dues money to the Wallace campaign instead of the John Birch organization. For Miles, Butler, and others, the ready pool of whites who will respond to the racist signal has posed an enticement. This population, always hungry for activity or for the talk of activity that promises dignity and meaning to lives that are working poorly in a highly competitive world, constitutes an alluring prize. The people are needy and they respond quickly to the signal flag of race. Much as I don't want to believe it, Miles's movement brings a sense of meaning, at least for a while, to some of the discontented. To struggle in a cause that transcends the individual lends meaning to a life, no matter how ill-founded or narrowing the cause. For young men in the neo-Nazi group that I had studied in Detroit, Membership was an alternative to atomization and drift. Within the group, they worked for a cause and took direct risk in the company of comrades. Similarly, many people whom Miles's newsletter reaches derive a degree of self-confidence and dignity from the suggestion that they are engaged in a heroic struggle for the sake of a larger entity, the reborn family of whites. Having accepted a people particularly predisposed to racism as their base, having accepted a people particularly predisposed to racism as their base, the trap for the leaders is quite real. To animate this base, the leaders must put most of their energy into a particular kind of theater. The movement lives on demonstrations, rallies, and counter-rallies, on marches and counter-marches, on rabid speeches at twilight, on cross burnings with Gothic ritual by moonlight. By their nature, those actions guarantee failure and bear little relation to the issues of these lives. When interviewing the young neo-Nazis in Detroit, I have often found myself driving with them past the closed factories, the idle plants of our shrinking manufacturing base. The fewer and fewer plants that remain can demand better educated and more highly skilled workers. These fatherless Nazi youths, these high school dropouts, will find little place in the emerging economy. Enacting the charade of white struggle only buys a wasteful time out. The current economy has little use for overt racist drama. Labor is surplus. A permanently underemployed white underclass is taking its place alongside the permanent black underclass. The struggle over race merely diverts youth from confronting the real issues of their lives. Not many seats are left on the train, and the train is leaving the station. Stirred for a time by the emotions, but soon finding that nothing has changed in their lives, many waves of membership will pass through these movements. The symbols that are used by the movements touch them. The ape beast, the serpent, reflect deep human fears, but eventually the symbols lose their power as the individual asks, "What is happening to my life?" The weary cycle drains even the organizer. Butler ponders what it means to have accomplished nothing. Miles alludes to his own weariness. What is he to do, though? He asks. He has done this all his life. His wife is annoyed that he talks this way when he speaks with me. You make him talk about things he doesn't think about normally, Doc charges. Returning to the courtroom the next morning, I passed through the metal detectors, watched the seating of the jury, the entry of the manacled prisoners, the warm, dry-witted judge. The defense is presenting its witnesses. A sister appears for a young fellow who is already serving a long term for involvement in the order's robbery of an armored car. She attests that she and her brother were closer than most siblings. She says that nothing he had ever said would lead her to think that he advocated the overthrow of the government. She speaks plainly and clearly. Entering the court, she touched her brother's arm quietly as she passed him. To prove seditious conspiracy, the government must demonstrate that an agreement had been made to commit acts aimed at the violent overthrow of the government. Earlier in the trial, the government's witnesses have claimed that such planning occurred and that such an agreement was reached during a specific morning and afternoon's informal leadership meeting of some 30 people in Butler's living room on the Aryan Nation's compound in Idaho during the July 1983 Congress. The primary government witness telling this story has been Jim Ellison, who had ruled his own compound in Arkansas as leader of the racist CSA, Covenant, Sword, and Arm of the Lord. Ellison served a 20-year term and other charges since 1985. Apparently began presenting this version of the leadership meeting shortly after being denied parole in 1986. Ellison, who at one point had declared himself a descendant of King David and had himself anointed king of the Ozarks, reportedly had taken himself an extra wife from among his flock on the compound. Some said that he first had the husband declared spiritually dead. The defense now is presenting a series of witnesses who attended those critical leadership meetings in July 1983. Louis Beam, leading his own defense, quizzes a sequence of those men and women. At that meeting, Beam asked, "Did you hear any discussion of bombings?" No. At that meeting, at either of those meetings, did you hear any discussion of assassination of political leaders? No. Of poisoning of water supplies? No. Of destruction of public utilities? No. Of establishing of paramilitary training bases? No. Of procuring false identification? No. Beam conducts each witness through this series of items from the indictment. Each witness answers no to every item. Each testifies that the meetings dealt in a general way with the concept of whites moving to the Northwest and with problems involved in getting movement literature across the border to Canada. All of Beam's witnesses found the meetings unremarkable, much like many previous meetings in their political lives. Beam's string of witnesses, among them several organizers from Canada and the West, and the National Klan leader and his daughter from Arkansas, all walk freely out on the streets. They have nothing to gain from their testimony. Most of the government's witnesses face charges or are in prison and hope to benefit from their appearances in court. The government's cross-examination is not impressive. Witnesses are queried about their racial views in great detail as though their positions were in doubt. Action, however, not belief, is the issue. Several times, witnesses are asked whether they have read the Turner Diaries and whether that book does not outline the steps that might occur in a racist seizure of power. The Turner Diaries presents a clumsy but in places chilling fantasy about such a seizure. The novel was written by William Pierce, a prominent racist, and journalists like to present it as the order's blueprint for the revolution. In this court of law, its relevance seems scanty. The prosecution apparently hopes that jurors will discount defense witnesses on the grounds of their beliefs. At 41, Beam is relatively young. Dressed neatly in shades of brown, he looks self-possessed, glad to be on the offensive. He and his young new wife make frequent eye contact across the room. She had been the Sunday school teacher of Beam's daughter. A reporter ungraciously described her to me as a Yahweh freak. Here in court, she wears a frilled white blouse. During Beam's arrest in Mexico, she shot an armed federal who had failed to identify himself. During breaks and at lunch, I meet people I have seen before in Idaho and Michigan. I introduce myself to several whom I need to work with in later stages of the study. After the day of court, I drive to the airport. Miles and Butler are old men and tired. The government may well succeed in putting them away. On the drive, I see an old cat standing by the side of the road. It has been sideswiped and is retching into the gutter. I am concerned. At home next to my typewriter, I keep a photo that was reproduced in the New York Times in 1980. The photo shows a 10-year-old boy and his 8-year-old brother. They are in coats. Sorry for that. A woman holding an infant stands in the background. 6 pointed stars are sewn to the coats of one of the boys. And the woman, an officer of the SS, snapped this photo. Selig Jacob and Zarilu Jacob, minutes after they had arrived at Auschwitz, moments before they were marched into the gas chamber. In the photo, Selig's eyes are fixed. Zarilu's are puzzled. His mouth is twisted. He is near tears. The boys cannot tell what is happening. They are uncertain and frightened. So the woman was holding an infant standing in the background, and 6 pointed stars were sewn into the coats of one of the boys and the woman. Their sister, who somehow survived Auschwitz, came upon the photo in an SS barracks the day after liberation. This photo is my talisman. It reminds me why I study racism. For 4 years, I conducted interviews with black men and women on a terribly poor corner in Detroit. My respondents were all migrants from Alabama and Mississippi. Almost everyone had stories of relatives or townspeople who had been tortured and killed by hooded men in the night. The Klan, across time, has been a nesting ground for murder, whatever else it has been. Members of the order did kill, as well as rob, properly. They are jailed. The present trial for sedition, however, is troubling. The charge is odd. The government's case violates common sense. The defendants, in the end, are acquitted. I'm sorry for some of the interruptions that you heard. I hope they weren't too many. But this ending to this part, I want to read it one more time. The Klan, across time, has been a nesting ground for murder, whatever else it has been. Members of the order did kill, as well as rob. Properly, they are jailed. The present trial for sedition, however, is troubling. The charge is odd. The government's case violates common sense. The defendants, in the end, are acquitted. So we still have this happening today, and it brought back memories to me as I was reading it about how they wanted to take over the government, and in the story it makes reference to a similar thing that happened. What was this, like 2 years ago? And it just is, it brings me to I'm like, really? It's like, it sounds so similar how they wanted to take over the government, and this is exactly what they tried to do 2 years ago. And basically they're still on trial and probably could be. I hope that these people won't be acquitted, but anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this section as much as I did. And I will be back. I promise you that. There will be another published reading of The Racist Mind by Raphael S. Ezekiel. And please stay tuned to Black Living Room Talk for more conversation, stories, and information. And I am the only Nubian goddess in the living room tonight. Peace, love, and light. Hotel.